listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, thank you for joining us as you do each and every week. Before we get started with this week's episode, the usual homework for you guys: follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Also, leave a rating and a review on iTunes. We really appreciate those. 5-star ratings are best. You know you love the show, so give us a quick 5-star rating. Leave a quick review as well. Those help us out a ton. Also want to remind you guys, we are now available on Podcast One. In addition to all the other platforms that we are on, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, Podcast One is the newest place you can get us. So if you're a subscriber to Podcast One, check us out there as well. Also want to remind you guys about our partnership with Amazon. You guys have been so great with this in helping out veterans. If you've never donated to a veterans organization before, here's a really easy way to start, and it begins with Amazon.com. Go to our website, hazardground.com, click on the Amazon banner, and it'll take you right to Amazon.com. Do all your shopping. We get a percentage of what you spend. We take that money and donate it back to some of the great veterans charities you've heard here right on the Hazard Ground. So it's an easy way for you to help out vets without ever having to leave the comfort of your own home. And heck, you get to do some shopping and buy yourself some stuff while you're at it. Now that all that's done, let's get on with this week's episode. Our guest this week is a retired Army Sergeant First Class who, after 22 years of service, including 5 total deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan, and operational deployments to Bosnia and North Africa, has multiple jobs outside of the military helping veterans. He's the Director of Veteran Services at the Family Care Center, and he is also the Executive Director of the Colorado Veterans Health and Wellness Agency. Obviously in Colorado, he is Duane France, joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Duane, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so the work you're doing now, post-career in mental health for veterans, obviously very huge, very important. We'll get to all that coming up. We always start back at the beginning, and, well, how'd you end up in the Army?
Yeah, that's always a great question. We love an origin story, right?
Right.
Really, I joined, I didn't consider joining until really just before I graduated that senior year, looking at what's on the other side of graduation, and there wasn't much. I think I had applied to one private out-of-state Catholic university, and I didn't realize that, like with every adjective, you add another $10,000 onto it. And told my mom that, hey, you guys going to pay for college? And she was like, no, not at all. And this was 92, right? So this was after the Gulf War. Nothing really was going on. And, I was driving with my mom one day, and I said, I've been thinking about the Army. And just kind of threw it out there. And she was like, oh, that's not a bad idea. And I thought she'd freak out. And I went down to the recruiting station. It came back, and I said, hey, I'm joining on Monday. And she was like, yeah, that's not what I meant. And so then she freaked out. My dad was a Vietnam vet. So she said, hey, talk to your son. And he convinced me to try the reserves out. He said, if you want to go to college, try the reserves, and then, see what it's like. I did it for a year. I went to basic training. I was in the reserves for about 9 months. Did one semester of college to make sure that it really was not what I was going for, and then went active duty. By that time, I was sleeping in my dad's basement, working at a pizza parlor or something like that, and realized that no matter how much I had thought I wanted to join the Army to go to college, it was really about the adventure, excitement, and really wild things. And so about a year after the reserves, I signed up active duty, and my first duty station was in Germany.
It's a beautiful place to end up. All of us, I think, prior to 9/11, when we were making our sort of order of merit list where you wanted to end up going, like Germany was my first 4 choices. I didn't get a single one of them, but it was my first 4 choices. So if you're a young single guy in your early 20s or late teens, and the Army wants to send you somewhere remote in the world, you always go to Germany. But you ended up there. I didn't. Good for you.
Well, yeah, and they said, because when I went back after duty, they said, hey, you could be I had to enlist as a truck driver in the reserves. There's no combat arms MOS. I would have done whatever they wanted. But when I went active duty, they said they can't change your job. And they said, well, you can choose where you want to go. They said, you can be a truck driver in Texas. You can be a truck driver in Germany. And I said, yeah, not a hard choice. So my first duty station again was in Mannheim, Germany, and you're right, it was a great 3 years, 2 years really. That's where my first deployment. There's not that many of us that were in Operation Joint Forge. Joint Endeavor is the first Bosnia deployment. So we were there, boots on ground, crossing the Sava and getting in the middle of everyone that was doing bad stuff over there.
So let's talk about Bosnia, because it's sort of like a forgotten about time in military history. A lot of it was fought from 30,000 feet, right? There wasn't any real there was no combat, troops on the ground. Well, let me rephrase. There was no actual ground combat. There were troops on the ground, obviously in Bosnia, as you were one of them, but nothing from a ground war ever engaged. Everything was done from airstrikes at 30,000 feet. So what was that whole experience like?
Yeah, there were definitely those of us down there. We pushed in 1st Armored Division, and then in the second, that following year, 1st Infantry Division replaced 1st Armor. It was in combat. I say that, out of my 5 deployments, one that was the easiest, I guess. But it was more of an operational deployment, obviously a peacekeeping deployment, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't danger there. If listeners will check it out, bridging the Sava River was one of the greatest engineering feats, of the last 50 years. The flooding that happened there, then just the sheer amount of unexploded ordnance that, by the time that all the land had changed hands, and there was just all kind of mines and everything. So there was a lot of danger there. When we first got there were guys standing on the street corners looking at you at the corner of their eye with, AKs and stuff. But ultimately, I think the region had so much war that they were over it. They were done with it. So it was more about sort of building the infrastructure and keeping the peace and, sort of the teacher getting on the playground in between the folks that were fighting and kind of breaking them up.
So after Bosnia ends and you return from that operational deployment, what are you thinking at this point in your career?
That's it's another great question. It's one thing that always surprised me is sort of the serendipity of the choices that we make. I was actually going to get out at that point and go green to gold, and my squad leader, said, "Well, what are you going to do with it? What's your degree?" And I said, I wanted to be a teacher. And he said, well, that's what an NCO does. That's really what we do as NCOs is we teach. And so I decided to turn down green to gold one time and multiple times that I decided to stay on the NCO route versus the officer route, and told the re-enlistment NCO I wanted to go to airborne school en route to Fort Campbell or I won't re-enlist. And she was like, who cares, basically. But she did. I was able to get airborne school and then was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division, and pretty much the rest was history.
All right, so where are you on 9/11?
Back in Germany, actually. That's so I had been in Germany 2 times, and it's interesting for me. On 9/11, it happens in the afternoon. Everybody has the memories about it, but of course it was 2 or 3 in the afternoon for us. I'd met my wife, she's from Knoxville, Tennessee. And as I was traveling through between Fayetteville, St. Louis, we met. And so we had gotten married. We were expecting our first child. And so the opportunity came for me to leave Fort Bragg and go back to Germany. And so I took it, just being familiar with it and, right going up through the ranks by that time. And yeah, so we listened to 9/11 happen on the radio.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it wasn't because we were in our company area. We didn't have the TV or anything like that, right? So everybody, and this is when I talked to everybody else. It was, early in the morning and, maybe just getting the kids off to school or just getting into work call or what have you. So we didn't have any TV in our company areas. And the only thing that we really had was AFN. And, so we were listening to it, and
but let me ask you, just out of curiosity, because I mean, it's not like, the internet is booming and there's all this social media to be able to tell you what's going on that people are constantly monitoring back in 2001. So I'm just curious how, when you're sitting in Germany, you first learn about the news. I mean, was it or the radio on and people just heard it? I mean, how quickly does it disseminate through the ranks to American soldiers in Germany that all hell's breaking loose in America?
It again, in an amusing story at a very unamusing day. I was coming back into the building, and there was another guy. I think I was E6 by then. It was another E5. He came in, and he was like, "Hey, did you just hear a plane hit the World Trade Center?" And I'm like, "Shut up," right? Because this is the kind of guy who just, you just don't really believe him, right? And I'm like, so I walk in back into our company orderly room there, and I said, and you hear, this guy was just making up a stupid joke about a plane, hitting the building, and I just kind of blew it off. And I said, turn on the radio, see what AFN says. And you're right, it's not like the first thing was, to do was to go on to Google. And AFN had just broke the news, and it was after the first plane had hit, and like many others, we didn't realize it was that it was an attack. We thought that it was a mistake, an aviation accident, and I remember clearly I hadn't turned it on until the plane hit the Pentagon, and when the plane hit the Pentagon, that's when I turned to my NCO and I said, "We're going to war. That's it." There was no other way of understanding that it would be something different. And again, by that time, the word spread, and pretty much how everybody else was saying, they were gathered around TVs. Everybody was sort of gathered around all the radios and listening to, because over there, it's really AFN is what you got. And
right.
So we were listening to AFN radio, and it was broadcasting all the updates. One of the clerk, our supply clerk in the company, her father was a janitor at World Trade Center, hadn't gone into work that day, but it spent a couple of hours us trying to figure out, where her father was. And of course, you're overseas, right? So again, I very clearly remember the commander, I think, was coming up from a battalion meeting or something. He comes running down the hall and says, "Get everybody in formation." And we immediately went up to increased, security. Right. By that time, those of us who were sort of pre 9/11, post 9/11, we saw it change. In the late 90s, you used to be able to drive through Bragg, no problem. There were no gates. There were no, there were no guards. You had, Fayetteville on one side, Spring Lake on the other, and just, residents used Bragg Boulevard as a way to get through. And so the same thing in Germany, right? You could, come on and off, and the bases were pretty open. And then, like many things in the world, that changed in an instant.
Yeah, I just can't imagine. I mean, we felt helpless here in America. I was wondering, did you guys feel even more helpless because you're so far away?
I don't know. I think that it was very much a, let's take action. Not helpless as far as we're watching what we can, sitting there and what can we do about that. It's, there were definitely some, not some very apparent immediate threats, but there were some threats that we needed to address. And so we sort of took action on the small level to lock down. So this was in Kaiserslautern, and we were on Kleber Kaserne, which was one end of the town. And just like, in a lot of bases in Germany, you have a lot of small, and they call them Kasernes, but small bases. And so we were really, locking everything down and getting accountability and, making sure that, everyone was taken care of. So I think we were maybe a little too busy to feel helpless at that point.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're in Germany, and you're going to war, but it doesn't exactly happen for you for several years. So, tell me, kind of just bridge the gap before you get to that first deployment.
Yeah, that's. I mentioned earlier I wanted to go to the 101st. My uncle had been in the 101st in Vietnam, so my dad and three of his brothers had all been in Vietnam. I think between 67 and 69, and so I had. I sort of always wanted to go to 101st Fort Campbell. It was halfway between Knoxville, where my wife was from, and St. Louis, where my family was from. So basically, I said, let's go there, and then I'll go off to war. You guys will be taken care of. I really, like many others at the time, wanted to get in the fight and get something done. So I was kind of talking to my branch manager, and I said, "Hey, I want to go to Fort Campbell." And they were like, "Well, that they're going to war." I was like, "Absolutely. Call back in 2 weeks." So I called back in 2 weeks, and lo and behold, since I wanted to volunteer for something, they nominated me for recruiting duty, and I couldn't get out of it, no matter how hard I tried.
Oh man!
So it's sort of like training for the Super Bowl for 10 years and then being stuck up in the front office while everybody else is playing the game. So, yeah, I was out at Fort Meade, Maryland. By the time, so Afghanistan had already kicked off by the time that we left. When we were in Germany, our unit, our location was one of the first aviation air bridges into pushing support into Afghanistan. So we were doing that. But then, I was in Fort Meade, Maryland in 2003 whenever Iraq kicked off. And so, yeah, I was selling the Army to people that wanted to join up.
I wonder, do you think back to those times and you thought your job was fairly easy at that point because there was so much fervor and so much patriotism floating around?
Yeah, I don't think that recruiting was ever easy. You had a lot of, there were people that said, hey, I want to join. And of course, not all of the people that said I wanted to join were necessarily people that you wanted to have in the military. And I was recruiting outside of a military installation, so it sort of kept an honest man honest. If I was talking to a young man or woman about joining the military and I tried to blow smoke up their butt, then they just go talk to mom or dad or uncle, and everybody knew somebody who was in the military in the area. And so as much as, it was, look, there's a job to do. Here's an opportunity for a job to do. They say that, you recruit in your own image. I put a lot of guys in who were tired of sleeping in their dad's basement, right? Saying, look, here's an opportunity to do something with your life, to do something with the, and the fact is you couldn't deny it, and everybody asked me straight up, do you think there's a chance that I'm going to go to war? And it's like, yes, there is a chance. And, join the military and you'll get trained up for it and you'll get taken care of.
I always, I chuckle at that because it's like, the naivete towards, you think there's a chance I'll go to war? And then quickly, and Iraq kicks off in 2003. And by the time, you're done recruiting in 2005 and you move on in 2006, it wasn't like, no, you're going. There's not a chance. You are going to deploy at some point in time.
Yeah. And again, it was that one of those things that was just sort of took that question off of the table. And, and my thing, I always knew that I wasn't going to be a recruiter forever, right? It was an assignment that the military gave me, and I appreciated it. It actually helped me become a better leader later on in my career because, I'd spent so much time, around 18 to 21-year-olds as a recruiter. So it did help me as an ops sergeant, a platoon sergeant by the time I got to Fort Carson. But I also knew that it wasn't going to be forever, right? There's some, recruiting is its own MOS, and I could have transitioned and I stayed there. But again, that's not what I signed up for. And so I, got out. And one of the things that I always did was if I had a young man or woman sitting in front of me and I said, if I walk into the motor pool a year from now and this person is standing in my formation, would I be okay with that? And so it was a little bit of my way of saying, you know what, it's a way for me to take care of the Army as well as, give a future to a bunch of good young men and women.
You mentioned Fort Carson. That's your next assignment. Ultimately, you deploy out of there to Iraq. How does that all happen? And what are you told? Where are you heading? What do you know?
Yeah, and this was by this time, if there is a place to be stuck in the Army, Fort Carson is on the top of the list of people want to be stuck at. My younger brother joined not shortly after I believe joined when I was in Iraq, and he got stuck at Fort Polk and had to get out of the Army just to get out of Fort Polk. But my family and I ended up my career. I got there in 2006 and I got out in 2014 and spent the rest of that time at Fort Carson in various units. When we got there, it was 2nd Brigade, 2nd ID. So again, those who sort of follow this early transition of the early years of OIF, there was a brigade in Korea that was pulled out of Korea and deployed to Ramadi, and then and then when they left Ramadi, they came here to Fort Carson. And so this was 2nd Brigade, 2nd ID. By the time I got there, I was the first sergeant, the commander. There were probably 20-something people in our unit, and we had a roster of about 160. So it was supposed to be a big unit, and I was, I think I was the first E7 in the company. There was only one other platoon sergeant. So this was January of 2006. A handful of people in the company. nobody had deployed because the Army, in its infinite wisdom, took all of all the senior leaders. All of us came off of recruiting duty at the same time. So only the company XO and the first sergeant had even been on a deployment before. I think we had like 3 vehicles. We had very little equipment. That was January of 2006. And by October of 2006, we were up to full strength and deployed to Iraq. And so things were really ramping up very quickly at that time.
Yeah. And of course, 2006, end of 2006 and 2007 is when the surge begins. I mean, I was there through the middle of 2006. So you're talking about the height of violence, both sectarian and military at that point in time.
Yep.
When you're in Iraq, what's your mission when you get there? What are you supposed to be doing?
So 2nd Brigade took over north of the river in Baghdad. So we were at...
Which river, Tigris or Euphrates?
The Tigris? Yeah. Tigris.
The one on the east or the one on the west?
The one on the west.
Okay, yeah.
So we were in Ras Maya before it had been Camp Cuervo, but it was on the north side of the river, sort of southeast, I guess, of Sadr City. And our unit's responsibility was logistics in the area. We were the brigade logistical element, and running patrols, deploying supplies anywhere north of the river. We'd get pushed in from from Balad, and then we'd push supplies out the sector. But the other significant thing was our unit was responsible for battle damage recovery, and at that point it was when the EFPs, the explosive force projectiles, are the weapon of the devil. It just we would see just vehicles, tanks, significant armored vehicles just peeled open like
can of tuna fish.
Yeah, and so we were there, and it was like you said, it was a very kinetic environment. It was between that time where everybody left Sadr City alone, so we sort of danced around Sadr City, which
was a tactically smart move because that place was less than fun.
Right, which is when they stopped going in 2004, and then they went back in 2008. So we were there, basically we were there during the concretization of Baghdad. Our unit was the ones that hauled all the equipment, that put up all the barriers and barricaded the different markets and stuff. And you're right. While we were there, we were one of the ones that went there on 12-month orders, and then was extended for 15 months. And again, that was a fun little shock. So yeah, I was there from October of 2006 to December of 2007.
You guys take any losses on that deployment?
Our unit specifically, no. And this was one of the things, is a lot of, because of the security, and the curfew and everything, and we did all of our patrols at night, right? And so we would, when we'd push, and we didn't go very far, of course, Brewers and Plutos and, Predators, and they were all dangerous routes, but, we pretty much had secure routes to get the supplies there. Some casualties and some firefights and things like that, but nothing when it came to anyone significantly in our losses, in our unit. But because of the nature of what our unit did, with battle damage recovery, we saw it all. We had a young man who was probably the single best, driver that we had in the unit. Halfway through, he had seen more dead bodies than he had years on this earth. Right. And it was so widespread there and so difficult that, it was kind of all over.
You're talking about American soldiers, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
When he comes back and tells you everything that's going on, can you grasp not only visually what he's talking about, but, the entire scene?
Well, yeah. I think that we had all, by the time, of course, we got, too far into it, it became, and not to say that the lives weren't important, but it became routine. It became something that, this is again, something else that we do. And, we treat everyone with respect, but it's just that when you're in it, it's just sort of the job, right? It's the day-to-day issues. It's not until you come back and sort of don't have time to figure out, let's go on to the next mission. That's when things really start to creep in for guys and gals.
Any of your soldiers kind of talk to you about everything that they had seen, and did you realize they were struggling then? I mean, I know you said it becomes routine, but sometimes that's dangerous more than anything.
I think it was actually there at that point that I started to think. I started to see that what these guys and gals were going to be dealing with in 15 years were the same thing that my dad and his brothers dealt with, 15 years after Iraq. So I don't think that we really, yes, you have the memorial ceremonies and things like that. I think I saw the impact there, and that's really what started me down the path of considering mental health as a career after the military.
All right, so that deployment ends 15 months, and you end up getting back. And what are you thinking now? I mean, is your career still on the same trajectory? You go back to Fort Carson, obviously, and you end up being told in a couple of years you're heading out again.
Well, yeah, but again, the Army in its infinite wisdom, 2008 would have been the only year that I had at home between 06 and 13, right? We would have, because we didn't have a deployment scheduled until probably 15 months later. But again, the Army deciding that, the mission is important. The summer of 08, they pulled a bunch of recruiters back out into the recruiting field to try to, they quote unquote wanted to surge the recruiting field just like they surged in Iraq. And so basically I spent 3 months, I spent the summer of 2008, almost 4 months, trying to put people back in the Army and just being pissed off because I didn't want to be there. I left recruiting for a reason. And, I wanted to get back to my platoon. So then when that was over by the fall, I came back to my original unit that I had been in. By that time, 2nd Brigade had transitioned into 4th Brigade, 4th IB. And then I took over a platoon in October. Again, this is the same kind of timeline of October of 08 or September of 08, something like that. Here's a brand new platoon, train them up, and then by July of 2009, we were back. And this time we went to Afghanistan.
All right, so you've been to Iraq, and for those obviously listening who aren't military, Iraq and Afghanistan are vastly different places. Not only just from a landscape standpoint, but just the battle, the operational tempo, and everything else was dynamically different. Do you have the same sort of similar mission in Afghanistan, or what was this one?
No, and you're absolutely right. I always say, number one, I've been to Afghanistan twice. I had 2 Afghan deployments, and I could see myself going back to Afghanistan. How like these guys go back to Vietnam and visit. I really have no desire to go back to Baghdad. You can keep Baghdad. There is nothing that's ever going to really make me want to go back and sort of visit that. But Afghanistan is a beautiful country. It's very rich. The heritage is huge. Our mission, and we were in RC East, and this is something that not a lot of people are really familiar with, is, in Iraq, there are obviously some places that are more challenging than others. But of all of the medals of honor that have been presented for the Afghan war, it only comes out of 2 places. They've only come out of 2 places, which is Regional Command East, which is the Paktika, basically along the Pakistan border, and then the Helmand province, because the Marines were really getting hit hard. And so, Cop Keating occurred while I was there.
Sure, yeah.
So we were in the Kunar Korengal. Our mission was to escort. We were basically, at this point, security escort and not pushing supplies ourselves. So my platoon's mission was to conduct security for supplies that went from the main base there in Jalalabad all the way up into where the Cav Squadron was, ultimately the unit that was there in Cop Keating. And that one was much more kinetic, but we would, it's like 120 miles, and it would take 3 days for us to escort the supplies. And it was much more kinetic. By the time July came around, pretty much every time we went out, we were in a firefight. And especially when we got up to the higher reaches of the Kunar River Valley. And so it was a lot of firefights, and then there towards the end of the deployment, it took the old IED started to come in and really start to disrupt things for us.
How so?
Well, when where we were at, so the last 20 miles up, and those of your audience who may be listening to this who've been in Afghanistan, the mountain roads are pretty treacherous, and we had these big Army vehicles, and pretty much at one point you have a 20-mile stretch of a dirt road that took us probably about 10 hours to go 20 miles, just because of the terrain, because of the danger. We were so close to the Pakistan border. Of course, there were firefights and things like that, but you didn't have to tear up the road too much to be able to disrupt a large, convoy of supplies and stuff. So, again, firefights and disabling vehicles, and it was pretty much a fist fight just getting through there every time we went up in the spring or in the fall, and then again in the spring.
With that environment going on day to day, do you ever start to feel like, eventually something bad's going to happen to one of us? We're too exposed, we're too out there. Do you ever get that overwhelming feeling?
Again, I guess I think it had to do with the fact that it was part of the job, and at that point we did. We lost one. Her name was Sergeant Wolf, and essentially RPGs started piercing the sides of MRAPs and RG-31s, and they were in a particular firefight, and she was on the RTO, and the RPG pierced the skin of the vehicle, and that, just in my unit, but also in our sister unit, at 361 Cav, it just the losses were, nearly, unfortunately, weekly, if not almost sometimes daily. So it was something, again, that you recognized that it was price of admission, part of the job. And we did our best to make sure that everyone that we had out there with us was the right people, right? We had, and again, everybody, says that your world shrinks to your foxhole, but, your vehicle crew and the vehicles that are around you, that you pretty much just rely on, the people there. I think a lot of it was, and I guarantee you that I got out of the vehicle much more than I probably should have, but you're not thinking about that. You got a mission to do. A vehicle gets stuck. If somebody gets in the way, and you just, you got to get them out of the way. You got to resolve the problem. And so, yes, definitely, there was that sort of in the general sense, but when you're on the route, you're just, how do we get things done?
How does that deployment end? How long are you there for? And kind of when it all gets to a wrap, is there like a sense of relief that it's finally over?
Yeah, it ended in such a cliche way, right? We were, because again, we're supposed to be, transitioning, and we had a really good unit we were transitioning with, and our last patrol was supposed to be about 3 or 4 days before we left, and we get off of the patrol, and we think, hey, all these guys are, good to go. And my company commander's standing there, and he's like, hey, yeah, I need you to go out one more time. And I was like,
famous last words.
Yeah, and he's like, look, the command needs, So me and one of my section sergeants went out on one last patrol. Got into. At this time, we're not in charge of anything, so we're just sort of sitting along for the ride. But we got off of the road, and then 2 hours later, we're on a C-130, heading to Manas, right? So it's this idea of, how soon you can be in a firefight and then get back home. It was probably a week later that I was in Tennessee helping my brother-in-law build a deck for my in-law, right? So I mean, it's one of these things with how quickly everything shifted. You really don't have time, I think, to be relieved. And I had a very good experience with the guys that replaced us. The guy that I replaced in Afghanistan was actually the platoon sergeant of the guy who replaced me. So we had a really good connection. Turns out that one of the section sergeants in the platoon that replaced me, I had put her brother-in-law in the Army. So there was all these different connections that were there, and I was half of my mind was in Afghanistan when I was back here in the States. We had if they stayed to our, timeline, they'd be on the route this time and they're on Stetson over here. And, did we do everything? Did we train them enough and all this other stuff that's going through your head that, I don't know that there was a sense of relief for a while.
How much of the compounding, and we're going to get into the mental health stuff you do, once we're done going through your career, but I'm just kind of curious as we go through this, how much from first deployment to second deployment does the mental stress compound, not only on you particular, but the guys that you're with, the other people in your unit? Are you starting to sense that they are starting to feel the weight of this thing?
Yeah, and a good portion of the unit, so this was the same company, and I would say probably about half of the unit had been with us in Iraq, right? So we were already, still a pretty solid team. And I actually had a section sergeant, and, to talk about the compounding thing. He was in 10th Mountain as a private or something, was lower enlisted in 2001. So he was with, he was deployed to one of the first conventional forces in Afghanistan for, 6 or 7 months. Then he comes back and he PCSs to Fort Stewart, and then he's in 3rd ID in on the invasion of Iraq, right? So invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq. He was with us in the surge in Baghdad, and then he was with us in the surge in Afghanistan, because that's when President Obama really pushed a lot of troops there in 2009, 2010. So, if you look at the first 10 years of these conflicts, this guy was at the point of history on both ends of the scale, and he had been in for 10 years. And afterwards, and absolutely one of my top guys, and he was like, I can't do it anymore. I got to get out. And he got out at 10 years. And I was trying to do everything I could, of course, to beg him to stay in, but he was like, it had already cost him one marriage, and, and he was just like, I don't want to anymore. It's like, and not to fault him for it, again, in a 10-year period, this guy saw more combat than most people had in their entire careers. And so there was a lot of that going on, that, the intensity of those years weighed a lot more than, and like you said, it accumulated, it built up.
All right, so then your last, you're again, obviously still at Fort Carson, you said, but you have one more deployment to Afghanistan.
Yeah, again, trying to wheel and deal with Branch. We had come back, and my battalion had another deployment to Afghanistan. I had taken over a company by that point, so I was a company first sergeant. But I came down orders for Fort Leonard Wood, and I said, no, thank you. I have no desire to go to Fort Leonard Wood. And so, like many other people that do strange things for strange reasons, I was back in Afghanistan probably about 9 months after I left, because I essentially made a deal with my branch manager. I said, you send me on the first thing smoking, and you make sure I get back here to Fort Carson. I'll do whatever you want.
There's a lot of people, by the way, Duane, there's a lot of people who would say you probably made the right choice over Fort Leonard Wood be Afghanistan. You're not probably on the wrong side of that.
There was, that is exactly right. That is not a decision that I regret at all. In as much of trying to take care of the family, I say that me and the family have been here since 2006, but they've been here since 2006. And of course I had the whirlwind tour. And, so it was a type of MIT team, the mobile training teams. They needed a senior NCO, on an assignment. Essentially what we were doing in Kabul is, conducting, observer controller duties for, the Afghan National Army. We were certifying them at the end of their training. We worked closely with with the Ministry of Defense and the training and evaluation team there. And by that time, it was about 9 months, our time had wound down. And one of the interesting things, how I ended up at Fort Carson is, even back then, the branch manager had said, hey, do you want to jump out of airplanes again? I was like, sure, why not? And they said, okay, we can send you to Fort Bragg, or we can send you to Fort Carson. And I said, I know the airborne unit at Fort Carson, the 10th Special Forces Group, send me there. When I got here to Fort Carson, I didn't have pinpoint orders, and I didn't end up going to 10th Group. So by that time, I figured I'd hung up my jump boots for good. Leaving Afghanistan, I get my orders, and sure enough, 15 years later, or whatever it was, they decided to let me jump out of airplanes again. So that's when I got assigned to 10th Group for the last several years in my career.
That's awesome, man. I deployed with those guys for my first deployment. Good dudes over there. And as you can tell, the 10th Special Forces guys are one of the more fun groups out there. They're not like the 5th Group guys or the 3rd Group guys. 10th Group has a whole different sort of mentality.
No, yeah, absolutely they do. And, I like to say, special just isn't part of the name. Because they've got the battalion, one battalion in Germany. And then they have the 3 battalions here. And it was really, it was fun for me. Really what my plan was, I'd stayed in 22 years. My plan was to see what kind of job I had when I came back from Afghanistan the second time. And if I liked it, I'd stick around. If not, I'd drop my retirement paperwork. But it was a really great unit. I feel like I really went out on the top of my game. It was a fun time. I was able to go the last, it was an operational deployment to North Africa with those guys for about 4 months in the beginning of 13, where we set up a camp for a multinational training exercise. So we spent some time in Mauritania. And again, jumping out of airplanes and things like that. Unfortunately, it was part of the issue was I got hurt on a jump in 2012, deployed with that injury, jumped 2 more times just to make sure I locked my injury in good and tight because I'm a moron. And by that time it was, again, it was really, the family and I decided, by that time I had also, and this is where everything was parallel, I had already started my master's degree for my clinical mental health counseling. I already knew what I was going to be doing, or believed I knew what I was going to be doing when I got out. And so it all just, with the injury and the time coming up and the master's program coming to a close, everything wrapped up at the same time back in August of 14.
And I know, by the way, for those anybody listening from 5th Group or 7th Group or 3rd Group, I wasn't disparaging you guys, but you guys know it's just a different environment for each one of the SF groups, so I didn't want anybody to take offense to it. Now, you just had mentioned that you knew what you would. When did you figure out that you were going to do the mental health thing?
I think it was really sort of a long time coming. Like I said, I saw it in Iraq that there was going to be a need to address some of these things. And sure, there were people addressing, psychological issues, even as far back as Iraq. Another unit that had been on their base lost the first sergeant to suicide. And, there was just, seeing what all that stress was happening. And then when I came back, and this would have been 2008 into 2007, beginning of 2008, I was in one of these post-deployment briefings, and there happened to be a therapist from the local vet center who was a retired major. And she said, oh, by the way, to us, there's probably 100 of us in the room. Oh, by the way, if any of you are interested in psychology, consider a career in the mental health field, because there's not enough combat veterans in the mental health industry. And that sort of dropped a stone in the mind. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, that's probably something I could do. Because, what does the platoon sergeant or the first sergeant do? Hey, Joe, what's going on? Take a knee, and tell me about what's up. So there is a level of mentorship and expertise when it comes to taking care of your troops, mentally as well as physically. So that's when I really decided to, kind of go down that route. I was finishing my bachelor's degree. And this is one thing that, can't thank the Army enough, but every single one of my degrees the Army paid for. And then by the time I got out, the GI Bill. And so, that was all taken care of. And so by the time that I was in Afghanistan the second time, I'd finished my bachelor's degree in psychology, and I had already known that, I'd need a master's degree to be a clinical mental health counselor. And by the time I got back to Carson and in 10th Group, that's when I enrolled in my master's program at a school here in Colorado called Adams State University, and then retired in August of 14, and then graduated with my master's degree in the spring of 15.
So what is the nature of the work that you do right now for both of the organizations that you're a part of, both the Veteran Services at the Family Care Center and the Colorado Veterans Health and Wellness Agency?
So the Family Care Center is a privately owned outpatient mental health counseling agency. I like to describe this as sort of like a civilian vet center. So how the vet center is separate from the VA, and they have their outpatient therapy arm. And that's what we do. We're here at Fort Carson and Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado Springs. So there are a lot of military families, but our agency specifically focuses on military families. Used to do some service members, not so much anymore because the military has really stepped up in that regard. And then we shifted to a lot of veterans. But when I started, so I actually started working in my time in the military overlap because I was we have to do internships, so we have to actually be a practicing clinician before we graduate. So I was with this organization starting in January of 14, and we were working with the local veterans court. So justice-involved veterans, Joe goes downtown and gets drunk in bar fights or, what have you. And they find themselves in the back of a cop car and standing in front of the judge. And so in 2009, the Veterans Court sort of came around here in Colorado Springs. And then in 2014, my agency was providing services to a lot of them. So that's really what I was doing. I was a primary therapist just for the Veterans Court. And then in 2016, sort of took over all of our veterans programs. We work very closely with the local VA and other organizations to provide outpatient therapy. At the same time, I saw that, it's great that we're giving these veterans, the help that they need once they plead guilty to, whatever it is, a crime or what have you. Why can't we help veterans before they get to that place? And there's just so many barriers to veterans getting, treatment, outpatient therapy. Of course, some of it is the stigma. But then it's just, the cost of it and insurance and whether they have insurance or don't, or the accessibility of it or the frequency of it. So that's where we started the nonprofit arm of the business, which is the Colorado Veterans Health and Wellness Agency, where we provide grant-funded services to veterans in the area at no cost. I personally don't think that a veteran should have to pay for their own mental health treatment. So I go out and I find other people to pay me to see veterans for therapy.
Duane, why are we failing right now from a mental health standpoint from veterans? Is it lack of care? Is it lack of adequate care? Is it on veterans themselves? I mean, why are we failing in this area?
Like a lot of different things, I think it's a complicated issue. From a clinician point of view, the mental health community is failing because we don't have very good PR. We believe in what we do. We know that we have a good product, but we don't sell it very well. Everybody has this idea of what a therapist looks like. If you're a guy, you smoke a pipe, you have a jacket with patches on your elbows, and you ask me to talk about my mother, like Freud. If you're a female therapist, then you're most likely going to burn incense and sit cross-legged on the floor while you ask me how am I feeling, which isn't true, right? But everybody has these stereotypes of what they think therapy is or what they think therapy does. And so that's a challenge in my industry, is how do we communicate to veterans and how do we give veterans what they need? But the other thing is mental health in America and perhaps around the world, but it's always just sort of this taboo subject. If I'm at a party, even like I blasted my foot on a jump, I'll talk about that all day long, but I won't talk about the depression. I won't talk about the anxiety. So there's this taboo around mental health. There's a stigma in the veteran community, but also when the veterans actually want to reach out, somebody needs to be there to answer, the knock at the door. And so I think it's a complicated issue on a lot of different fronts.
What's the way ahead? How do we start to change not only stigma and perception, but, how do we start to get the actual care that's needed?
Well, and that's, again, one of the other things many things that I do is really just trying to communicate to veterans that, look, this isn't mental health is no different than physical health. If I say physical health, you don't automatically go to the thought of cancer or diabetes, right? You go to, fitness and wellness. But when I say mental health, especially when it comes to veterans, everybody automatically goes to the PTSD, right? And even that's not true. So a lot of it is, and my goal and what I do even on my own website and podcast is trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. It's about, supporting wellness, not curing illness, and really trying to get the conversation out into the community, while at the same time helping the mental health community say that veterans are a unique culture, that we need to understand how we communicate with veterans in a therapeutic sense, right? We all hear the horror stories of a veteran that goes through talking about the worst day of their life, and their therapist can't even hold it together, and they're sitting there crying, and veterans like, I'm not going to come back to you with this. If you can't even handle it, how can you help me handle it?
Yeah.
So I think it has to do with educating the mental health field about the unique nature of veteran mental health, while also getting the veterans and their families and those who support them to understand that this ain't nothing different than going to the dentist.
Yeah, I like that idea on its premise, but I think the problem with veterans is they realize that, some of them may feel like it's going to the dentist, but, the dentist actually is a plumber dressed as a dentist, like that's what I kind of feel like a lot of veterans may feel, as you just talked about. They're not equipped to handle, the understanding and nature of combat and how it goes. And it's something we talk about a lot here on the podcast. You'll never understand combat if you've never been in it. Think about it this way. Like, you can have a guy who's never played football study the game, watch it, and, understand the intricacies of it and the nuances of it and be able to describe it really well to somebody. There's no way to watch combat from afar and understand what your body and your mind go through and be able to translate that to somebody else, right?
Yeah, sort of, right? I know many mental health professionals who have worked with veterans for a very long time that have taken their experiences, taken the veterans' experiences and really learned from them, grew from them. From the mental health standpoint, from a psychology standpoint, Dave Grossman's books on war and on killing, are excellent descriptions of what happens to us when we're in combat, both neurologically, biologically, and psychologically. But Dave Grossman never actually deployed to combat, right? He was a mental health professional who worked with veterans and did the research. Imagine if you and I went to go live in Germany and we could learn the language and we could learn everything about the culture. We could get 99% of the way there. We're not natural born Germans, but we can get farther than just somebody who, picked up German 2 in high school. And so there are a number of veterans. There's actually a book, Achilles in Vietnam, which really talks about moral injury by a psychologist named Jonathan Shea. And Jonathan Shea admits he had never deployed, but he worked with a lot of Vietnam veterans in the 70s and 80s and of course, even beyond. But he said that I'm not a native speaker, but I've gotten 98% of the way there. He says, I recognize that those last 2%, that they can be really, really critical, but it's also, you don't have to have been a veteran to treat a veteran when it comes to mental health. You do have to make sure that the person you're talking to has taken the time to listen, learn, and understand the unique aspects of military culture. But there's simply, and it goes back to the earlier point, is there's simply not enough of us, those who have deployed to combat in the mental health field, to be able to serve all of the needs of the veterans.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing, and that's where I was coming from the standpoint of maybe we do need more veterans who are willing to step up and treat other veterans, because, look, I always say it on the podcast, no one knows how to take care of us better than us. It's just what we know how to do. It's always about the man next to you. It's always about the person next to you, and we understand that better than anybody. And to that end, we are better equipped to treat each other, so to speak, and be the buddy that or the voice that you need, because it's easy to tell us what we're going through.
You're exactly right. And at the same time, we have to be very careful for a veteran who is also a therapist, a mental health counselor, to not let it turn into, a two-way war story swap, right? There's times where it can actually, it be detrimental sometimes. I've had some clients that, that weren't cool with the whole senior NCO as a therapist thing, because the senior NCOs in the military were some of the challenges that they had, right? So everybody has sort of a unique need, and for those veterans, and is it necessarily true that somebody says, I can only talk to a veteran? Not really, but if that veteran thinks it's true, then it is. And so having a wide range of individuals who are able to connect with. My colleague that works with me in the programs that we do now, she's a Gold Star wife. She understands the military and arguably understands the military in ways that I have no understanding of at all, having been through what she went through. And so the two of us working together, she works well with some veterans. I work well with other veterans, and it's addressing what the veteran actually needs, in whatever their recovery is going to be.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, that's very admirable of her, as far as being a Gold Star wife and still wanting to do that and really provide, and give back. I guess that's a great way to deal with the grief. But, let's kind of put some final thoughts on the mental health discussion, because obviously it's lengthy and we could do it forever. But what's your message to veterans who may be struggling right now? And how do you approach them? What do you say? I mean, how do you make them feel comfortable about the decision that, hey, I do need help?
Well, first, I think it has to do with awareness, right? That we have to be aware that there is something wrong or something not right, or however you want to phrase it, right? That there's something that isn't going well, whether I'm not sleeping or I'm drinking too much, or, I'm on my third marriage, whatever the issue is, my relationships are disrupted, that there's an underlying cause for this. Could it be combat? Sure. Could it be military? Could it be something, even farther back? But not only is there a cause for it, but there's also help out there that's available. And again, just trying to pull the curtain back and demystify what therapy is and what therapy can do for you. Again, we have this hocus pocus, mind reading, I'm not going to talk about my feelings, or, no, we don't talk about your mother unless your mother's the problem, right? It's whatever is going on psychologically. A lot of the concern, especially we talk about these transition now, is we have so many resources available for veterans, right? We're going to get them a job, they'll feel better. We're going to get them, get them connected with Team RWB or Team Rubicon, and they're going to be back in their community. And only when all of those other things don't work out, then do we say, oh, by the way, there's a mental health guy in the back in the shack here. Maybe you should go talk to him because nothing else works. Where arguably, mental health and wellness is the foundation of transition, and we don't talk about it much. It's the foundation on which everything else is built on. The turnover in the employment space, the lack of satisfaction in our relationships, of course, when it comes to depression, but even just, the guilt or the survivor's guilt that we might have, all of these different things, once we get them in place, then we can actually have a better post-military life than maybe we're experiencing now.
Well, Duane, listen, I mean, the message is incredible, and obviously one that needs to be told over and over and over again, because whatever the numbers are, whether it's 22 a day or what, they are what they are, right? It's not a good situation right now, and obviously it needs to improve, and the worst thing we can do is continue to pretend like, the proper things are being done to get the help, to get veterans the help they need, because clearly that they're not. But what you're working on and what you're doing is obviously a step in that direction. And seriously, I mean, it's without guys like you out there pushing the message, these numbers would be worse. I mean, it's you can't say it any other way.
No, and you're absolutely right. And even focusing on what the ultimate numbers are, but even focusing on the problem of suicide, right? Suicide is a lagging indicator of the underlying problem. It's a symptom. It's not the thing that we need to address. And we need to address whatever it is that caused the veteran or is causing the veteran community, of which it's almost unique to everybody who takes their own lives. But really, if we're addressing suicide, it's the way I describe it. If I walk into a doctor's office and I have a runny nose, I expect the doctor to tell me whether it's the flu or whether it's allergies, because they're going to address each of those things differently. It's the same thing with suicide. It may be family issues for one veteran, may be, traumatic stress reaction for another, or addiction, or a bunch of these different things. to address the veteran suicide epidemic, we absolutely need to address the underlying mental health condition. And to be able to do that, we as mental health professionals need to get involved in the conversation as much as everyone else is.
Duane France, thank you for your message and thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.